Now that we have tackled the color wheel, let's get into the importance of warm and cool toned colors. You may already know that in their most basic forms, red, orange, and yellow will be warm toned, and blue, purple, and green will be cool toned. However, you can actually have a warm or cool toned version of almost any color. Take, for example, these two different reds. Both of these colors could be considered red. However, the warm toned variation has a little bit more yellow, and the cool toned variation has a little bit more purple. So, if any color can be warm or cool toned, how do you know which is which? Let's use blue as an example. Blue is a naturally cool toned color. However, this does not mean it cannot have any warm toned variations. To achieve this, we simply have to add in warmer toned pigment to our basic blue. In this case, if you add a little bit of yellow to your blue, it is going to lean more warm toned. Just remember not to add in too much yellow or you'll end up with a green. A good way to figure this out is to look at the color wheel and see which direction you can move the hue to make it cooler or warmer. It is important to note though that this is all relative to the other colors in your illustration. If your illustration is mostly cool toned, then the warm toned blue will stand out. However, if you use a lot of bright reds, oranges, or yellows, then this blue will still read cool toned. So it is important to understand your color palette as a whole when choosing your cool and warm tones for a drawing. So, how does this affect your art? The most important thing to remember when choosing your colors for an illustration is that warmer toned colors are going to stand out more and feel closer to the viewer than cooler toned ones. Because of this, you're going to want to incorporate warmer tones into your foreground and focal points, and cooler tones into your background. This technique also follows the principles of atmospheric perspective, which describes the effects of particles in the air on the way the human eye perceives our environment. Have you ever seen mountains that are really far away? You may have noticed that they can appear hazy and more cool-toned than areas of the landscape that are closer to you. This effect is caused by particles in our atmosphere scattering the light we are receiving from the sun. The more particles that are scattered between you and an object, the more hazy, low contrast, and cool-toned they will appear. So to recap, any color can have a warm or cool-toned variation. Warm colors feel closer to the viewer, whilst cool-toned colors recede into the background. And atmospheric perspective causes distant objects to appear cool-toned and hazy. For this lesson's activity, we're going to be experimenting with warm and cool tones and atmospheric perspective to see how they can be used to create depth in our illustrations. To do this, you're going to be creating a rough landscape thumbnail. So now is a good time to grab yourself some references if you'd like, or you can just follow along with me. I want you to take a desaturated, cool toned variation of blue and set it as your background color. Then select a light, cool blue from your color menu. For this exercise, I chose to use the Max Hue Gouache Clean Brush, but again, just like in the previous exercise, you can use the hard round brush as well. I set this brush to a kind of large size and I increase the opacity to around 80%. Then I go in and start mapping out the very background layer of my illustration. For me, this is some distant blue mountains. This is just a quick exercise, so don't worry if things get too messy. As Bob Ross would say, there are no mistakes, only happy accidents. So sketch in whatever little mountain shapes your heart desires. If you've chosen to draw something different in this activity, just remember to use a cool toned color for your background. In this activity, I'm just going to be using the color blue, moving from cooler tones in the background to warmer tones in the foreground. Just remember to keep your background simple and not too detailed. Once you are happy with how the shape of your background mountains are looking, I want you to go into your layers menu and add a new layer. Then I want you to go into the color pick menu and select a color that's slightly more warm toned, a little bit darker in value, and the tiniest bit more saturated. You might have to experiment with this a few times until you find the correct color for your illustration, but you want this color to be noticeably darker and more warm toned than the color you used previously in the background layer. For this layer, just roughly block in the shapes that you want for the midground. For me, I chose to have this sort of mountain going into a bit of a rolling hill shape, but you can really do whatever you would like. As we did earlier in the illustration, I want you to go back into the color picker and select a color that's slightly more warm-toned, slightly darker, and a bit more saturated. We're going to use this for a second layer of the midground. At this point in your illustration, you might want to start experimenting a bit with some texture. As you can see here, I've added some bumps to the hill to try and represent some foliage, but you can really experiment with different effects and techniques to find what works best for your illustration. Once you are happy with this, you can go in and select the next color for the next layer in your illustration. Again, we want it to be warmer toned, darker in value, and more saturated. Since we're getting closer to the foreground now, you'll see that the color I'm using here is much warmer than the original color we were using for the very back layer of the background. I also start adding in a bit more texture the closer I get to the foreground, because you actually will see a lot more detail the closer an object is to you. Since we're just doing a quick sketch for this exercise, it is totally up to you how much detail you want to put into this. It can be really simple or a fully rendered illustration depending on what you feel up to today. Once you're happy with your background and midground, you'll be ready to do the foreground. Make sure you choose a color that is way darker, more saturated, and warm-toned in comparison to the other colors used in the illustration so far. You really want your foreground color to pop against the rest of your illustration. We're coming into one of my favorite parts of the sketch, which is getting to draw in some happy little trees, which, to be honest, I think is another Bob Ross quote, and I'm not sure how many of these I'm allowed to say in one video. Just like I said earlier, you can get as messy as you want with these textures. I like to use a downward angled squiggly motion to create my tree shapes. If you get to this point in your illustration and want to add even more depth, you can add another layer, select a darker and more warm-toned color, and add a few trees to the foreground that are even closer to the viewer than the ones you have drawn already. As a final touch, you can even add some atmospheric fog between each of the layers in your sketch. To do this, I like to use a soft airbrush set to the color that I had chosen for the sky earlier in this exercise. I then go in and add fog to the bottom half of each of the layers. And there you have it. We've used warm and cool tones to create an awesome dynamic landscape sketch. Great work in this lesson, and I'll see you in the next.